Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. It started the way these stories often do, not with a kiss, or a look, or even a word. It started in the quiet and the neglected spaces where love used to live. It started with a feeling I couldn't name. For years, Ethan and I had shared a life that looked beautiful from the outside. Our house was warm and lived in, framed photos lined the hallway, and our calendar was always full: dinner parties, work trips, family events. We were a good team, responsible, efficient, predictable, though we had stopped seeing each other somewhere along the way. Not physically, we still shared a bed, still sat at the same table, but emotionally, it felt like we were standing on opposite ends of a frozen lake, calling out through the silence, waiting for the ice to break. He was behind me always, it seemed. Supportive, kind, never cruel, but also absent in the ways that mattered most, absent in attention and presence. Our conversations had become functional, our touches mechanical. He loved me, I never doubted that, but he loved me quietly, passively. From a distance, I could no longer tolerate Dot. Then came Julian. He wasn't someone I expected, not someone I even noticed at first. A client introduced at a fundraising gala. Tall, soft-spoken, with that casual intensity some men carry like a scent. You can't forget. We shook hands, smiled, exchanged polite conversation. It should have ended there, but at ID in single quotes T. We started running into each other more at meetings, events, gallery openings. He'd remember small things I said weeks earlier. He'd ask questions no one else had thought to ask. He looked at me like he saw something I had forgotten existed. Not beauty, not desirability, but hunger, depth, conflict. I remember the first time I felt it, really felt it. We were walking out of a meeting late in the evening, and he asked, "Do you ever feel invisible in your own story?" I stopped in my tracks. The question hung in the air between us like fog. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. From that moment, I knew it began with conversations. Harmless, I told myself. We talked about books, memories, mistakes. He listened in a way that felt like being held. I started looking forward to the days I'd see his name in my inbox. My heart would skip. I would linger on what to reply. It was subtle at first, like a violin tuning quietly before a symphony, but the melody was coming. I knew it. Ethan, of course, noticed something. He wasn't oblivious. He asked if I was okay, if I was tired, if I needed a weekend away. He tried in his way, but it was too late. I was already drifting, already leaning towards someone else. Not out of cruelty, but out of starvation. One night, after a conference, Julian and I found ourselves at the hotel bar. I should have gone to my room. I should have said goodnight, but I didn't. We sat close, too close. I don't remember the exact moment our hands touched under the table, but I remember how I didn't pull away. Later that night, he walked me to my room. I opened the door. I stood in the frame. He stepped forward, and I let him kiss me. It was not wild or desperate. It was slow, like opening a locked door and finally letting air in. We didn't speak much. There was no need to. Our silence said everything. The need, the ache, the betrayal. We didn't sleep together that night. Not fully, but the line had been crossed. Irrevocably. In the days that followed, the guilt arrived. Like a storm, I avoided Ethan's gaze. I deleted messages. I cried in the shower, but I also felt something else: aliveness. Something that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. I was split in two. The woman who wanted to repair her marriage, and the woman who had tasted something forbidden and now couldn't forget the flavor. Julian and I met again. Again. It became a secret rhythm: coffees, long drives, moments stolen like whispers. I told myself we were careful. I told myself I was in control. But then came the night Ethan found the message. It wasn't explicit, just a text. "I miss the way you look at me." That was all it took. He didn't yell. He didn't slam doors. He sat on the edge of the bed and said, "How long?" I couldn't lie. I didn't try to. I told him it hadn't been physical yet. That I didn't mean for it to happen. That I didn't know what I wanted. He asked me one question that has never left me. Did he make you feel more loved than I did? And the truth was, yes, not because Julian loved me more, but because he had reminded me what it felt like to. Be seen. Ethan left for a week. I stayed home alone with my shame and confusion. Julian offered comfort, but I asked for space. I didn't want this to become an escape. I needed to understand who I was becoming. When Ethan returned, he didn't give ultimatums. He said, "I'm still behind you, but I don't want to watch you walk away. I want to walk with you. If you'll turn around." I cried harder than I ever had in my life. In the end, I chose Ethan, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because I realized something about love. It doesn't always burn bright. Sometimes it waits, patiently, painfully, silently, and it forgives even when it's breaking. Julian and I ended with a single conversation. No drama, no final kiss, just gratitude. He had pulled me forward, yes, but it was Ethan who stayed behind me long enough for me to look back and say, "Come." With me, he had never stopped waiting. He just needed me to turn around, and I did. But endings, even the ones we choose, rarely feel clean. There wasn't a sudden peace after I told Julian goodbye. There was only silence, not absent silence. A vast, echoing space in which all my questions came back louder. For a while, I couldn't sleep. Even though Ethan had returned, even though he was there, I'd wake in the middle of the night and stare at the ceiling, wondering if I had made the right choice, or if there was a right choice at all. Choosing to stay didn't erase what I had done. It didn't magically stitch the fracture between us back together, but it was a beginning. We started over slowly. Ethan moved back into our bedroom, but we slept with space between us, as if, even in our dreams, we were afraid to reach for the other. He didn't ask questions, he didn't want the details. Knowing would only torture me, he said. What matters is what you want now. At first, that made me feel forgiven. Later, it made me feel cowardly. I thought about telling him everything. The dinners, the hotel bar, the near miss in that hotel room. But then I imagined his face, imagined myself breaking him twice, and I couldn't do it. Maybe he deserved the truth, but I needed to protect what we were still trying to rebuild. Sometimes silence is not a betrayal. Sometimes it's mercy, but even mercy can feel like a lie. We went to therapy. We talked about the years that had numbed us. About the choices we made, not just mine, but his too. His withdrawal, his silence, the way we had both allowed our love to become functional instead of sacred. He never blamed me outright. That made it harder. If he had screamed or thrown something, maybe I could have hated him. Instead, he's soft, devoted, and in that softness, I saw the weight of everything I had risked. But healing was not linear. There were days I resented him for not fighting harder before I had slipped away. Days he would touch me and I would flinch, remembering how Julian's touch had felt like being uncovered. There were days I craved Julian's voice, his certainty, his way of looking at me as though I were still becoming, rather than already defined. I never reached out to him again, but he stayed with me in dreams, in songs, in the space between conversations, not as a regret, not as a fantasy, but as a turning point. He had shown me what I had stopped asking for, what I had been afraid to admit I needed months past. Ethan and I began to laugh again, genuinely, one afternoon. I caught him dancing in the kitchen while waiting for the kettle to boil, and I laughed so hard I cried. He pulled me in, spun me once, and whispered, "I miss this." So did I. We made love again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. It wasn't the fiery, desperate collision I had experienced with Julian. It was something quieter. Familiar, but not dull. Grounded. Real. The kind of intimacy that only comes from choosing each other after the illusion of perfection is shattered. And slowly, I began to stop comparing. I began to see Ethan not as the man who hadn't seen me, but the man who learned to see me again, who stayed, who forgave, who waited for me not to be perfect, but to be present. But even as we healed, I never forgot what I had done. Infidelity doesn't always leave a wreckage in plain view. It's not always screaming, slamming doors, broken glass. Sometimes it's just a quiet fracture in the timeline of your life. A before and after. A shadow on the otherwise sunlit path. Sometimes I would catch Ethan looking at me too long, like he was trying to read a page I'd already torn out. And sometimes I still dreamed of Julian, not with longing, but with curiosity. Wondering if he ever missed me. Wondering if somewhere in a different version of our lives, I had followed him instead, but I didn't. I stayed, not because I had to, not because I owed Ethan that, but because I looked at the man behind me, the one who hadn't pulled me forward, but who had stood still in love's long shadow, waiting for me to turn around, and I chose him. And every day since, I've chosen him again, even on the days I remember the other one. Especially then, because love isn't always about being pulled forward. Sometimes it's about finally turning around and realizing the one who stayed is the one who truly saw you all along. Time, it turns out, doesn't heal everything. That's a myth we tell ourselves so we can sleep through the night. What time does is soften the edges. It takes the sting out of the memory, but it doesn't erase it. And in our case, the healing came not from time, but from intention. Ethan. And I built something new, not a return to what we were, but a tender reconstruction. A version of us that was less perfect, more honest. We didn't try to forget. We tried to understand. We kept going to therapy. Sometimes we went together, sometimes apart. And in those quiet, structured hours, I said things I never thought I'd say aloud. I spoke about how lonely I had been in our marriage long before Julian arrived. About how I blamed Ethan for pulling away, but hadn't reached for him either. I admitted that I had wanted to be rescued from boredom, from invisibility, from a version of myself that felt too small. And Ethan stoic, composed Ethan spoke too. About the pressure he felt to always be steady. About how he had mistaken my silence for contentment. About the guilt he carried for not noticing how I was slipping away. It didn't fix everything, but it made us softer with each other. The intimacy came back gradually. First in small touches, then in shared jokes, then in the familiar rhythm of two people who once knew each other by heart and were learning again. It was a slow reintroduction to a love we had taken for granted, and every moment of it felt earned. But Julian never truly left me, not in the sense of obsession or regret, but as a presence, a ghost of who I had been when I met him. Sometimes when I walked alone or sat in a coffee shop reading, I'd think of him, of the questions he asked, of the way he listened. Once, I even saw someone who looked like him across a train platform. My heart stuttered. I almost called out, but I didn't. I just watched him walk away, letting the past pass me by. Like a train I no longer needed to catch, Ethan and I began to travel more. We did things we never made time for before. We took a cooking class together, went hiking, stayed up late watching old films with subtitles and messy dialogue. We kissed again in public like teenagers. And we fought too differently than before. Not to win, but to understand. There were moments that tested us. Like the night we visited his parents and someone knowingly made a comment about how lucky we were to have such a solid marriage. Ethan looked at me across the dinner table, and for a split second, the pain returned. But he reached for my hand under the table, and I squeezed back. We both knew the cost of our survival, and we chose not to hide from it, sometimes late at night, when Ethan was asleep beside me, I would lie awake and wonder what love really means. Is it loyalty? Forgiveness? Chemistry? Surrender? Maybe it's all of that. And maybe it's the choice to stay. Not just once, but every day after. Never told Ethan everything. Not because I couldn't, but because I knew that love wasn't about confession for the sake of my relief. It was about honoring the healing we had built. He knew enough, and I carried the rest. The last message Julian ever sent was a year after. It all ended. I hadn't heard from him in months. It was short. I hope you're happy. Truly, that's all I ever wanted for you. I didn't reply, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that happiness wasn't something someone else could hand me. It wasn't in being pulled forward or followed. It was in the standing. The staying. The choosing Dot, and so I stayed Dot, and he, the one who had always been behind me, he became the one beside me again, not because we were perfect, but because we had walked through the fire and still reached for each other in the dark, because he never asked me to be less than what I was, because I had finally turned around, and because, in the end, love didn't save me, I saved myself. And then I chose a love that could hold that truth. Years passed, not quickly, not without effort, but they passed the way life does after something breaks and is carefully put back together, edges softened, cracks visible but stronger, where mended, Ethan and I became not just partners again, but companions. We learned how to sit in silence without it being avoidance, how to disagree without fear of unraveling, how to celebrate the ordinary moments, groceries unpacked together, hands brushing while reaching for the same apple, him bringing me tea without being asked. Love began to feel like a rhythm again, not the urgent beat of first passion, but a steady hum that held us. There were things we never fully spoke of again. I never said Jillian's name. Ethan never asked. But there was an unspoken understanding between us that what had happened wasn't a rupture to forget, but a moment we had to carry forward, together. Once, during a long drive up the coast, Ethan pulled over to watch the ocean. We sat there for a while, windows down, salt in the air. He said, "I used to think love was about being chosen first, about being enough to never be looked past." I didn't respond. My throat was sick. He continued, "But now I think real love is about being chosen again, even after everything. Especially after everything." I reached across the console and took his hand. "I choose you every day," I said. And I meant it. We didn't become some cinematic story of redemption. We still argued about bills, forgot anniversaries, got on each other's nerves. But beneath all of that was a depth we hadn't known before. A knowing. A scar that turned into something sacred. Sometimes I would think of Jillian not with desire, not even with sadness, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement. He had been the catalyst, the mirror, the fire. And I had needed all three. But it wasn't him I had built a life with. It wasn't his hand I reached for in the dark when nightmares came. It wasn't his voice that calmed my panic or remembered. The way I liked my eggs on Sundays, it was Ethan, and he wasn't behind me anymore. He was beside me, there was a day. Many years later, when we sat on the porch together, older now, our hands more wrinkled, our breaths a bit slower. A storm rolled in over the trees, the first drops of rain tapping on the wooden railing. I looked at him, thinking of how far we had come from silence to distance to forgiveness. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different? I asked. He turned to me and smiled softly, the kind of smile that says I've already asked myself that too many times. "No," he said, "because we made it through this. And that's the only version I want." The rain began to fall harder. We didn't go inside, we just sat there weathered, worn and wildly, deeply together. Not the kind of love that sweeps you off your feet, but the kind that stands behind you, waits patiently, and when you finally turn around, holds you like it never let go. That was the ending, but not of our love, just of the version of us that had once believed it couldn't survive the fire it had. And we had two.